People rarely feel intimidated by what quiet people say. They feel intimidated by what their silence refuses to confirm. That's the part nobody names clearly. Intimidation usually has an obvious source. Someone aggressive, someone who dominates, someone who challenges you directly. You know where it came from. You can point to it. But the discomfort a quiet person generates is different. It doesn't come from anything they said. It doesn't come from a look or a confrontation. It comes from an absence, and an absence is much harder to locate, argue against, or defend yourself from. So instead of dealing with it, most people do something else. They perform. Watch it happen in any room where there's one genuinely quiet person and several who aren't. The quiet person sits down and doesn't produce much. They don't fill the air. They don't compete. They're not being cold. They're just not generating the continuous social output most people are used to receiving. And within minutes, something shifts. Someone starts talking more than usual. Someone explains a decision nobody asked them to explain. Someone laughs at something that wasn't that funny, a little too quickly, a little too completely. Someone repeats what they just said, but with different words, as if the first version didn't land. Someone glances at the quiet person after every sentence, not to include them, to check, to see if it's landing, to see if they're being received. The quiet person gave no signal that any of this was necessary. Nothing happened. And that's exactly the problem. Most social interaction runs on an exchange people almost never think about consciously. You say something, the other person responds, not just with words, but with signals, a nod, a laugh, a shift in posture toward you, an expression that says, yes, I'm here. What you're doing is working. Those signals close a loop. They tell your nervous system that the social environment is safe, that your presence is accepted, that the performance you're running is landing the way you intended. That loop closes dozens of times per minute in normal conversation. Most people don't register it because it closes reliably. It's like breathing. You don't notice the inhale until it doesn't come. A quiet person doesn't close the loop on the expected schedule, not because they're withholding deliberately, not because they're judging, because they simply don't feel the compulsion to emit that continuous current of social reassurance everyone else in the room is exchanging without thinking. They're not on that frequency, they're operating on a different one entirely. And when the loop doesn't close, the other person's system registers something. Not fear exactly, but a low, persistent signal that something requires management. And the most immediate way the mind knows how to manage it is to produce more signal, more output, more effort to get the confirmation that isn't arriving. So the person talks more, explains more, defends positions that weren't being challenged, fills silences that didn't need filling. And while all of this is happening, they genuinely believe they're just being sociable. They have no conscious awareness that what they're actually doing is chasing a response that a quiet person isn't going to give them. Not because the quiet person decided to withhold it, but because they never needed to give it in the first place. The critical thing to understand is what that chase reveals, not about the quiet person, about the person doing the chasing, because you can only chase something you need. And if the absence of social confirmation from a relatively neutral person throws you into performance overdrive, that tells you something precise about where your sense of security is located. It's located outside yourself and other people's reactions. And when one person in the room stops reflecting that security back to you, even passively, even without doing anything, the structure starts to wobble. That's what people are actually experiencing when they say, a quiet person made them feel off. The quiet person didn't do anything to them. The quiet person stopped doing something for them, something they didn't know they needed until it stopped. What feels like intimidation is often just the absence of reassurance. There's a concept in Jungian psychology about how people deal with parts of themselves they've repressed. What they can't integrate, they project. Not randomly, with precision. The traits that generate the strongest reactions in you are almost always the ones closest to home. The qualities you've buried most thoroughly in yourself are the ones you respond to most intensely in others. So when someone encounters a quiet person and starts to feel unsettled, the useful question isn't, what is the quiet person doing? The useful question is, what does the quiet person's behavior make you aware of about yourself? In most cases, the honest answer is something like this. Their indifference to social approval makes your need for it visible. And visible need, in a culture that prizes confidence and self-sufficiency, is the thing people work hardest to hide. Here's the mechanism. Most people who perform heavily in social settings have built a stable identity around being liked, being entertaining, being the one who makes things easy and comfortable. They've internalized the belief, often from very early on, that their social value is conditional on their output, that if they stop performing, they'll be exposed as less than what they've been presenting, so the performance runs continuously. It's not cynical, it's become indistinguishable from personality. Now put that person next to someone who clearly isn't running the same program, someone who doesn't need to land their jokes or confirm their social standing through continuous output, who is simply present without the machinery. The contrast is felt before it's understood. Something in the first person reads the quiet person as a challenge, not because of anything specific they did, but because their existence in that space, operating on entirely different terms, raises a question the performer would rather not hear. Why are you working so hard? That's the projection Jung described. The dependency, the performance, the continuous need for confirmation, the things you've most thoroughly suppressed in yourself, suddenly show up in the person who doesn't have them. And they read as a threat, not a rational threat, the irrational kind. The kind that makes you feel defensive around someone who hasn't said a single unkind thing. Now, and this needs to be said clearly, not every quiet person is operating from groundedness. Silence can come from fear, from social anxiety, from someone who desperately wants to engage but can't get there. Silence can be withdrawal, passivity, or simply disengagement. And on the other side, some people fill rooms with noise because they're genuinely energized, genuinely warm, genuinely expressive, not because they're running a validation loop. Loudness is not always performance. Quiet is not always depth. But that's precisely what makes this specific and important. Because when someone feels genuinely intimidated, destabilized, uncomfortable, slightly threatened by a person who isn't doing anything aggressive, who is just quiet, the source of that intimidation is almost never the quiet person's behavior. It's the projection. It's whatever the observer can't locate in themselves that they're suddenly seeing reflected in someone else's ease. If you've ever been called intimidating when you barely said anything, this is why. Not because you did something threatening, because your stillness stopped feeding a system that needed feeding. And the system didn't know how to process that. Silence never arrives neutral. That's the part most people miss completely. The same stillness from the same person in the same room reads as calm to one person, arrogance to another, depth to a third, and threat to a fourth. The silence itself carries no content. The content is entirely supplied by whoever is looking at it, and what they supply is not random. It's drawn directly from what they're carrying. A person at peace with themselves reads a quiet person as settled. A person running on approval reads them as withholding it. A person afraid of being exposed reads them as watching. The quiet person is a blank surface, and people paint their own internal landscape on it, then react to what they painted while believing they're reacting to what the quiet person did. Some people don't fear quiet people. They fear not being validated by them. Those are completely different fears. But from the inside, in the moment, they feel identical. Put this in specific places and watch what happens. A meeting at work, 6 people in the room, one of them quiet, present, alert, listening, not checked out. They ask one question about 40 minutes into a 90-minute conversation. One precise question, not aggressive, not critical, just specific. Then they go back to listening. Watch what happens to the people who have been talking for that 40 minutes. Several revisit what they said before the question. Some add context they didn't initially offer. Someone softens a position they stated firmly 10 minutes ago without fully acknowledging the shift. Someone who wasn't going to speak suddenly offers a qualification. The question wasn't an attack, but specificity in a room full of people who have been performing rather than thinking lands like exposure because it signals that someone was paying very close attention. And when you've been performing, close attention is its own kind of pressure. The quiet person didn't do anything wrong. But several people in that room will leave with a vague, undefined sense that the quiet person has opinions, that they're hard to read, that there's something slightly uncomfortable about being around them. None of them will trace that feeling to its actual source, which is that the quiet person's precision made their own imprecision visible. In social settings, the structure is identical. The consequences just land softer. The person at a dinner who doesn't perform enthusiasm, who doesn't exclaim over every story, doesn't amplify every joke, doesn't maintain the emotional volume of the room, creates discomfort that the louder people around them will attribute to them. They'll say later that the quiet person seemed judgmental, cold, that they made the conversation harder. What actually happened was simpler. The quiet person's frequency didn't match the room's frequency, and the dissonance was uncomfortable. But the room doesn't attribute that to the dissonance. It attributes it to the person who wouldn't match. In personal relationships, it gets more specific and more damaging. The partner or close friend who doesn't perform their emotions at high volume, who processes internally, who doesn't fill every quiet moment with verbal output, gets accused of being closed off, of hiding something, of being emotionally unavailable. The accusation almost always comes from someone whose model of intimacy was built on emotional display. And when display is absent, that model reads it as absence of feeling. What's actually absent isn't feeling. It's the performance of feeling. Those are not the same thing. The quiet person ends up carrying a charge they didn't generate. They get labeled arrogant because they didn't signal humility loudly enough. Cold because they didn't perform warmth on the expected schedule. Mysterious or withholding when they were simply not broadcasting. And over enough years, those labels accumulate into a belief, sometimes the quiet person's own belief, that something about how they naturally exist in social space is a problem that needs fixing. Teachers asked why they were so quiet, as if it were a malfunction. Managers suggested they speak up more to demonstrate value, as if their listening was invisible. Friends told them they seemed distant. Partners said they need to open up more. Every one of those interactions carried the same embedded instruction. Adjust yourself so others can be comfortable. Your natural frequency is costing people something. Fix it. That is an enormous amount of pressure to absorb over a lifetime, and the particularly brutal part is that most quiet people absorb it quietly, which only confirms to the people doing the labeling that something is definitely wrong. Understanding this changes something specific, not everything. Something specific. It changes what you think is happening when people react to your silence. Because once you see the mechanism clearly, once you can track that the person over-explaining themselves around you is chasing a confirmation you're not going to give them, that their discomfort is a reflection of their own dependency and not a verdict on your character, you stop interpreting their behavior as feedback about you. You stop taking the performance as a signal that you need to perform back. You stop translating their discomfort into an obligation to relieve it. You stop preemptively filling silences you didn't create, laughing at the pace the room demands, nodding with an urgency that doesn't match how you actually feel. This is not indifference, it's accuracy. The person over-explaining didn't do it because you did something wrong. They did it because your stillness created pressure in a system that requires constant reassurance to feel stable. That's information about their system, not a complaint about yours. When someone talks too much around you, they're not expressing confidence. They're negotiating it in real time with themselves, using you as the audience they can't get a clear response from. Once you see that, really see it, why not as a concept but as something happening in front of you, the dynamic loses its grip. It stops being a thing that you're somehow causing and starts being a thing you're simply witnessing. And something else changes. The people who can sit with your silence, who don't flinch, don't overperform, don't fill every gap, start to stand out clearly, not because they said anything impressive, because they didn't need to. They didn't reach for noise when silence was there. That tells you something significant about where their security comes from. Silence doesn't create insecurity. It reveals where it already was. There's a quality that people with genuine quiet carry without choosing to carry it. Not performed quietness, not studied restraint. People for whom stillness is simply the baseline. It reads as steadiness. As someone who doesn't need the room to tell them they're okay. And in a culture where enormous amounts of social energy are organized around getting exactly that confirmation, from conversations, from performance, from the continuous return signal of other people's approval, encountering someone who isn't running that program creates a specific disruption. Not the disruption of aggression, the disruption of contrast. When everyone in a room is trading reassurances, matching frequencies, keeping the collective comfort level stable, and one person simply isn't participating in that market. The contrast is felt immediately, sometimes consciously, often not, but felt. What the quiet person has, functionally, is more available attention. They're not spending most of their cognitive and emotional resources managing how they're coming across in real time. They're not continuously adjusting their presentation based on incoming social signals. And that availability shows. It shows as the ability to actually listen, to catch things others miss because everyone else was busy performing, to ask the one precise question that reframes a conversation that had been going in circles for 20 minutes. This isn't a superpower. It's what happens when you stop spending your attention on the performance of being present and simply are present. People call this intimidating. The word isn't quite accurate. What they mean is that they feel exposed in a way they don't usually feel, and they can't trace it to a specific cause. They feel their signals are being received, but not returned on the expected terms. They feel uncertain about the verdict. And uncertainty about an unseen verdict is one of the most persistently uncomfortable social experiences there is. What they don't realize is that there's often no verdict coming. The quiet person isn't composing an assessment. They're just not running the same social software. The gap between those two things, no verdict, versus a withheld verdict, is enormous. But from the outside, when you're already anxious, they feel identical. The silence doesn't arrive as silence. It arrives as whatever the other person is afraid it might mean. That's the full mechanism. The quiet person didn't install the fear. They didn't introduce the insecurity. They didn't create the dependency on confirmation that makes their stillness feel like pressure. All of that was already there. What they did, without choosing to, without knowing it, was stop providing the noise that normally drowns it out. The quiet person didn't change the room. They just stopped helping it hide from itself. And the people who feel most unsettled by that are almost always the ones who most needed to look.